Hello, welcome back to Chicano Studies. In this lecture, we will focus on the farm workers' struggle, focusing on the UFW and people like Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta and their role in shaping the Chicano movement. As you're probably aware, the UFW wasn't really a civil rights movement, but definitely helping the transition from from labor issues to a civil rights movement. Definitely influenced a whole new generation, particularly because a lot of the parents of many of these Chicano activists that come out of the later part of the 60s were part of the UFW, and many of them took their kids to many of the strikes that were taking shape in California. So there's a direct connection between the UFW and the Chicano movement. So the goals for this lecture is, number one, we're going to explain the labor organizing movements in the fields. So we'll look at movements prior to the Chicano movement or prior to the 1960s in the UFW, and also look at some of the major ones that took place during the 1960s. And then lastly, we're going to describe how the UFW shaped the Chicano movement. So it just wasn't one thing, but definitely played an important role where the UFW gave a lot of the, if not tactics, definitely the language, right, with cultural nationalism taking shape in the 1960s to the Chicano movement. As I noted a second ago, many of the activists of the civil rights in the Mexican American community participated in many of these struggles in the fields. So let's address some farm workers' movements before the UFW. As you may know, farm worker labor is always seen as unskilled labor, so it's one of these industries that's really difficult to unionize, which is why what the UFW and Cesar Chavez did is seen somewhat of a miracle, because farm workers are so difficult to organize because it's seen as unskilled labor, as though anybody can do it. But people have tried to unionize them prior to the UFW. So I want to give you a few examples. There's many out there, but a few examples of how some workers, not just Mexican Americans, but just workers in general, try to organize farm workers, and they were always unsuccessful. So the first one I want to talk about is the Wheatland Strike of 1913. This is in California, where the Industrial Workers of the World, which is a union at the turn of the century, try to unionize farm workers along with other industries into one big collective union. So in case you're not familiar with unions, unions are established to help the working class get better living conditions, improve wages, hopefully obtain things like healthcare, but also help improve the industry by such a thing as safety, making sure people don't die trying to do a job at this time. And here specifically, many Mexican Americans lived in these kind of shanty towns, obviously received horrible wages, and some of them had really horrible living conditions where their kids would get sick. Many of them end up dying through diseases because there was no sanitation. They lived by polluted drainage ditches at this time. Farm owners didn't really care how they lived. All they wanted them was to work. So the IWW made inroads into the Mexican and Mexican American population to unionize. And at this particular strike, we see how the owners were able to connect with the local government and bring in the National Guard to help end the strike. In the aftermath, some people did end up dying, but what we see that in California did get a lot of attention. So the California Commission on Immigration and Housing got formed to hopefully try to address these issues. But because a lot of times these things are kind of politically controlled, it didn't really do much to improve the living conditions of farm workers. So this is a failed attempt, but at the very least, it's an attempt to unionize Mexican and Mexican American workers. There's a few other ones. Another one called La Liga Obrera, which means the Workers' League. And this is in Colorado, where, again, the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, formed this organization to organize laborers out in the beet fields in Colorado. Another example is in 1935, where 3,000 onion pickers in South Texas walked out over low wages. Now, in 1935, understand that there's a Great Depression happening at that time, so getting raises might have been hard, but still, these people worked hard and they wanted an increase in their wages, so they went on strike. What happens here is that the local government gets involved to stop them from unionizing. So the Texas deputy sheriff brought in scabs along with the Texas Rangers, and the Texas Rangers have a long history of abuse against not just Mexican Americans, but all kinds of people. And they come in to break the strike, and they arrested 59 strikers. So again, attempt is there to organize, but it wasn't successful. There's a few in California in 1936, again during the Great Depression. Hard time to unionize, yet these people were trying to unionize. Farm workers fought for unionization, with 4,000 workers going on strike at the orange orchard and packing plants in Orange County, California, fighting for higher wages. In this example, company brought in scabs, and unfortunately they were not successful. Another example in California is in Los Angeles, where Filipino, Japanese, and Mexicans united and walked out the celery farms. In this example, 1,500 deputy sheriffs and thugs, a few deputy sheriffs and mostly thugs, came in, and they brought in what was called at that time the Red Squad to end the strike. Basically, again, the local government, local police, government officers helped end the strike and arrested people. In 1937, there were around 16 strikes, with around 10,000 cotton pickers walking out of the fields. And again, they ended up losing the strike. So what we see in these examples that I gave you is, again, farm workers trying to unionize. All they're asking for is for better living conditions, better working conditions, and maybe a livable wage. But local governments, particularly the owners of these companies, worked with local governments to defeat unions. One example is where they actually bring in 12-year-old kids as strike breakers. This is a time where, age didn't really matter. As long as you could work, they put you on the field. And then, particularly in the 1930s, farm workers were not protected by government. I'll talk about this a little bit later, but basically, you were on your own for farm workers. You could not negotiate with the help of government helping you, bringing you to the table, if you will, to negotiate with the owners for better conditions. The federal government didn't recognize farm worker unions at this time. So basically, the owners could do anything they wanted to farm workers, particularly if they had control of local governments. Now, things begin to change, not for the better, actually for the worse. During World War II, we have the implementation of the Bracero program. As I mentioned earlier, in the 1930s, you have a lot of people that are unemployed due to the Great Depression, but World War II kind of allows the economy to recover, particularly the war, and growers are in need of farm workers because some of these previous workers that they had went to war, right? So they're losing a lot of their labor workers at this time. So in August 1942, they passed the Public Law 45, where they brought in basically cheap Mexican labor, with most of it going to places like California and Texas and the Northwest, Washington, and so forth, to go work out in the fields, right? Maybe some of your grandparents or great-grandparents participated in this program. And the argument was that it was established because there was no labor, right? That they were all out in the fields or in the industrial centers helping in the war effort, and there was a need for farm workers. So Mexico and the United States formed an agreement, brought in cheap labor, and this basically allowed for growers to exploit this labor pool. So definitely it helped stop unions from forming out in the fields. At the same time, it brought in cheap labor from Mexico, and they were supposed to provide things like housing, a kind of social security type program for them. And there was so much corruption; it was a big mess. You still hear about these issues even up to today, because some of these people that contributed to this kind of social security program never received the benefits from it. But overall, the purpose of this program was to bring in cheap labor to stop unions from forming out in the fields. But eventually, some of this labor does go into the industrial sector, into factories. Why? Because it's cheap labor. So this kind of really hurts the unionization movement in the farm industry and for farm workers. So when it comes to farm workers, most of us see the people who work out in the fields as invisible, right? We don't really care where our food comes from when we go to the grocery store. Even though these are some of the most vulnerable people, where they have high child death rates in many of these communities. Again, they live out in tents and things like that, right? They have they go without medical care because they cannot afford going to a doctor, and they definitely don't get any benefits like healthcare plans from their employer. Some of them cannot afford milk or meat, right? Things that allow them to sustain themselves. So this was really an uphill battle for many of these farm laborers out in the field. And the UFW kind of recognized that. First off, in the 1930s, we had the Great Depression, and in order to address the workers, because a lot of people lost their jobs, the federal government passed what's called the Wagner Act in 1935. And what this act essentially did was basically allowed workers the right to unionize and to be recognized by the federal government. So if there was a dispute between workers and the owners, they can come to the table and address it with a mediator at the federal government level. And unfortunately, this policy excluded farm workers and domestic workers, two industries that, particularly at this time, were dominated by minority communities such as African Americans and Mexican Americans. So if they wanted to form a union, it didn't really matter because they were not recognized. Mexican Americans were also excluded from the minimum wage and maximum hour legislation and from workers' compensation. As I mentioned earlier, right? They didn't get health care, they didn't get anything that could make their lives better. And they're basically just a hired hand, where they could quickly be fired if the owner just didn't like them for whatever reason. So they had no legal protection. Just to give you an example, when it comes to how much money they made in 1959, so the average salary was about 50 cents an hour in 1959. In places like Texas, farm workers earned around 16 cents an hour, right? So as I mentioned earlier, right, their living conditions were unlivable. They lived in tents or chicken houses or cardboard homes. Again, water was horrible. Healthcare was a major issue. If you ever worked out in the fields, those of you that have or have parents that have can probably tell you stories about how backbreaking that work is. And we see, as I mentioned earlier with some of the examples in the previous slide, is that farm owners had a strong control of local politics. And places like California, if you ever travel up and down the San Joaquin Valley, you see nothing but farmland, right? Very small towns, almost isolated. And many of these owners are connected at this particular time to the Republican Party, and they own everything there. Own in the sense that they control the senators, the congressional representatives, the local governments, the state legislatives, the city councils, the sheriffs, and the police. As I gave you examples earlier, right? Many of these owners would just call the police station to come in and break up these unions. So, these are obstacles that are really hard to overcome to try to form a union. There's more, but again, these are some of the highlights. of what the UFW and people like Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez were fighting against, and how they were successful somewhat is almost inspiring, because everything is against them at this time. So during this period, as I mentioned earlier, right, with the living conditions of farm workers was invisible, sorry, because again, people didn't see them. But in 1962, Michael Harrington wrote a book called The Other America, which focused on poverty in the United States. And all of a sudden, there was a bit of a shift where people's like, wow, I can't believe people live like this, particularly in the 1950s, where Americans are living in suburbia, right? They are living the American dream, mostly white Americans at this time. Yet they read this book and it's like, this is really America, right? The land of opportunity, the American dream. Why doesn't everybody live out in the suburbs with a nice house and a car and TV and all that good stuff? Where this book was somewhat illuminating. So in the 1950s, we continue to see farm workers organizing. One of the leaders is Ernesto Galarza, and he forms the National Farm Labor Union in 1947, where he fights against, again, wages and living conditions at the DiGiorgio Fruit Company, where they went on strike for 30 months. But like the other examples, the government came down and brought in strike breakers, and the union had to back down. At this particular example, we see how growers actually encourage illegal immigration, and the Border Patrol allowed it to happen. At this time, again, big farm owners, these are really corporations, they're not like some mom and pop type shop, right? Who lobby the federal government, allow immigrants to come into the United States with or without documents. They could care less about their legal status because they need workers. And Galarza, who wasn't just a farm organizer, he was actually an academic, he was an intellectual, focused on attacking the things like the Bracero program and addressing the corruption within the program. So it's not like he was just some like Cesar Chavez, like a UFW worker who kind of rose up the ranks, became an organizer. And Ernesto Galarza was an academic, but he also cared about the living conditions of farm workers. Probably another important person is Dolores Huerta, and she starts off in an organization called the CSO, kind of joining this organization to address, they address a lot of issues, voter registration and better housing for Mexican Americans, but eventually left this organization to join the Farmworkers Struggle. She was at first she was a teacher, and she has a really kind of important quote where she said, "I thought I could do more by organizing farm workers than by trying to teach their hungry children." So she quit teaching. This is, not that it was the greatest job, but it was a cushy job, right? It was consistent in regards to pay for her, but she gave all that up to go and fight for workers' rights, where she fought for minimum wage, Social Security coverage, housing, health, and educational benefits for domestic farm workers. And in the end, she ends up getting arrested and jailed around 20 times throughout her life. And even up to this moment, as I speak, she's still involved in activism at the age of 90 something, and still looks really, really healthy. So, in the 1950s, in an age where Americans are living it up out in the suburbs, we see, farm workers, particularly Mexican American farm workers, organizing and fighting against these, low pay, horrible living conditions out in the fields. So in the 1940s and 50s is when the UFW begins to form with people like Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. And their tactics, they use, obviously the strike is the most common one. It's a union after all. They use boycotts. And the boycott is important because farm workers are now recognized by the federal government, so they can actually engage in a boycott without getting in trouble. And they focus on nonviolent direct action. People like Chavez were influenced by people like Gandhi and MLK. So this was a tactic, particularly in the age of television, where these movements were being filmed, and they gave a visual of how police came in and started beating people with their batons and so forth. And these people just sat back and took the abuse, and they gave them the upper hand, at least through popular opinion, because they were not fighting back. But in 1965 is where we see some of the early success in the UFW. There were other prior unions that did obtain some of the things that they obtained here in the 1930s and 40s. But here specifically at the McFarland Rose Farm, the union, this is the UFW before it becomes the UFW, they actually went on strike, and the growers brought in strike breakers from Mexico. However, here they actually won this strike, where they got better wages but not union recognition. Probably the most famous one is at Coachella. Most of you probably know Coachella because of some concert, but this is a place where they grew a lot of grapes. And at this particular union, we see that it's not just a Mexican American movement. There were a lot of Filipino workers out in the field too. And this is where this other union, led by Filipino activist Larry Leong, merged with the UFW and went on strike together. Again, you're more powerful in numbers. So around 5,000 workers went on strike. And in this particular strike, it lasted around 5 years. So it's a long battle where people need to work, right? So they can't just be on strike out in the picket field the whole time. So they go on strike, and they actually use media to their advantage, where they boycott the grapes from these growers, but they also ask the public to boycott them. So they're out at places like Safeway passing out leaflets, information about how farm workers are living, right? Their working conditions, their wages and so forth, and asking the public to support this boycott. And the reason why they're eventually successful, it starts in 1965, I believe it ends somewhere in the 1970s. They are successful because they're able to get that national attention and have the support of the population not purchasing these grapes. But it's not an easy road, right? It took many years, half a decade here to be successful. Eventually in 66, we see these two unions, again, one led by Filipinos, one led by Mexican Americans, come together and form one big union. We see other examples. This kind of set the example, this somewhat of a success story in other places, like in Texas, where at Stark County, farm workers went on strike with Mexican American high school students and college students supporting the strikes by staging walkouts. They were out in the field picketing, they were boycotting, they contributed money and food, and joined many of the marches from the Rio Grande Valley to Austin, Texas. So many Chicano activists get their start through the farm workers movement. And by the 1970s, the UFW won this this grape strike, and about 2/3 of California grapes were actually under contract with the union. And the union itself had around 50,000 members around this time period. So it showed that prior movements might have failed, but by the 1960s and into the 70s, there's a major shift happening. There's a lot of reasons why, but these are some of the few examples as to why they were successful. So we see that there was some success. It's not perfect. It's not like the UFW just improve overnight the life of farm workers, but there were some success, obviously some failures too. For example, Ronald Reagan, who was governor of California at this time, was very anti-union and actually bought some of these grapes that were non-union and sent them to Vietnam to the troops. So, it wasn't perfect, but definitely got some benefits here. The UFW did for their workers, where we see a 70% increase in wages at this time. Other things like healthcare, some of them were able to obtain healthcare through the union, disability insurance, pension plans, things unheard of for farm workers because, again, these are unskilled jobs. They, particularly when it comes to the job itself, they were able to eliminate the short hoe, which kind of, it's not a shovel, but something like a shovel, right? When they pick potatoes or something like that, they have to bend over, and it's very taxing on the back. So they were able to eliminate that for a long hoe, which made it easier where you're standing to pick these things. So that helped with the physical aspect of the job. They pushed to end pesticides, and this is where maybe Cesar Chavez was significant, where he was able to use television to tell the consumer directly, look, not only are we being impacted by things like pesticides, there are stories out there where people were being sprayed while they were out there working with these pesticides, kind of showing how insignificant their lives were. But also, what he was trying to say is that you, the consumer, are consuming these pesticides, right? These are cancer-causing products that you ingest by obviously eating things like strawberry, right? So these issues needed to be addressed. Definitely benefited the farm workers if they could eliminate them, but he was trying to touch on the consumer end of how they're impacted by what happens out in the fields. Earlier I mentioned Dolores Huerta, who actually went to Washington, D.C. And lobbied against federal guest programs, again, better educational programs and stuff like that. She was really one of the key figures to help farm workers in this battle. So as much as it was and I want to stress this, that the UFW was a labor movement. It wasn't a civil rights movement. It was a labor rights movement where it focused on the living conditions of farm workers, trying to improve them. And that was its ultimate goal. However, it just happened to be that the majority of people who worked out in the fields tended to be Mexican American. So it felt like it was part of the civil rights movement, which is part of the reason why we included with the civil rights movement. But during this time, Cesar Chavez used his Catholicism upbringing to try to make the movement not so much anti-union by the general public. During this period, right, the living conditions of Americans are improving, so they tend to be a little bit, not that they're anti-union, because around, I think, like 60% of the American workforce were part of a union at this time. But a lot of times unions are associated with socialism or communism. So he tried to use kind of religious symbols to help get away from that perception that people might have. Now, in some of these movements, many Mexican Americans tend to be very Catholic. But the interesting thing was that the Catholic Church in some of these strikes did not support the farm workers, particularly in these small towns, because a lot of these small towns the growers ended up supporting the Catholic Church, right? They provided the biggest donations. So they try to be neutral. However, we do see a lot of Protestant religious groups participate in some of these strikes, and they definitely sided with the farm workers at this moment, whereas the Catholic Church was try to be in the middle. It did felt like you needed to make a moral stand, and Protestants did end up helping people like the UFW. In this particular movement, we do see a lot of religion elements being used in the movement. As I mentioned earlier, Cesar Chavez, try to present the UFW as just a labor movement, but again, the public would see it, or particularly politicians would call it communist. And just to give you an example, Cesar Chavez was in the Navy, but he actually never went to war during World War II. I think he was in 1946 after the war ended, but he would promote himself as being part, kind of his being very patriotic by participating in the quote-unquote war, even though technically he might not have been in it because he was in there a little bit, after the fact. But it was a bit of a shield to protect the Union from being called communist. And again, religion worked as that shield too, where he would use a lot of kind of religious elements, and would say, quote the Bible, turn the other cheek, treat others the way you want to be treated, right? To show the public that this was not some kind of communist plot, but rather it was just people living at the bottom of society and that needed help. He practiced nonviolence himself, definitely, again, like I said earlier, inspired by Gandhi and MLK. Though we do see, the police come down on many of these farm workers when they're on strike. So some of them ended up fighting back because of, they were just defending themselves. And a very important movement that took place is this idea of called theology of liberation, or other people call it liberation theology, where it was a Latin American movement that promoted this idea of that the Catholic Church should go back to its basic foundation of helping the poor, right? As I mentioned earlier, many of these churches in these small towns where these strikes were happening were dependent on the growers and were not taking a side. So this movement, liberation theology or theology of liberation, was focused more on that the Catholic Church should focus on those who need the help the most. And in this example, it would be people like the farm workers. Other things that he did, he used symbols, right? Like La Virgen de Guadalupe, you see that up here in this image. And, how can you be called a communist movement, right? Communists don't believe in organized religion. So how can you be a communist if, you have La Virgen protecting you? So, she becomes an important element of the farm workers, almost like a protector of these workers. He also did pilgrimage from Delano, California to Sacramento, again, having not only this labor movement, but almost like a religious movement. Other things that he did, I remember he went on the fast. The only thing he would consume is the communion wafer at this time. So he used religion as a way to help his movement. Another important aspect of the UFW is the way it impacts the Chicano movement. So Cesar Chavez, along with other organizers, would go to universities and ask people to help either organize or contribute their lunch money if they can to help in these farm worker strikes. So this kind of got them national attention by him going to, it wasn't just out in the rural areas where he was doing these things or doing these strikes. He was going into urban centers. Remember, this is the 1960s. It's not like today where, you put something in social media and it goes viral. Things moved a lot slower back then. So most people didn't know that some of these strikes were even happening. So by going to universities, particularly students who are socially aware with, again, a lot of the other movements that are happening in the 60s, this got them their help because they knew they were not going to do it alone. A lot of the terminology of the Chicano movement emerges from the UFW. Things like "Viva la Causa." Many of these activists in the 1960s in the Chicano movement use this, even though it's specific to the UFW. Other terms, "Viva la Raza," right, is another term. Dolores Huerta came up with "Si se puede," right, and these all become kind of mantras of the Chicano movement, not just the UFW. The UFW flag, often flown at many of the Chicano movement struggles, you see it right here, right? It's supposed to kind of represent the Mexican eagle on the Mexican flag. And this is something easy to draw where anybody can draw it and use it for whatever political action they're going to participate in. And we see it in some of the strikes in urban centers. Probably one of the most significant ones is Teatro Campesino. So Luis Valdez, who was a college student in arts, participated in many of these UFW UFW struggles and strikes. And strikes can be long, they can be boring. So what they would do is perform these small short skits that they would write, over a few days. And they're basically like plays, or what they called actos. And they addressed the issues that they were facing, but in the play format. And this kind of took a life of its own, where by 1967, it went out on tour to raise money for the farm workers' struggle, and it becomes an art form. And this is the beginning of the Chicano, what we call the Chicano Renaissance, a cultural renaissance that happens in the 1960s. And it definitely created a form of Chicano art here in these actos. And Luis Valdez went on to make very important movies like La Bamba and Zoot Suit. So some of these activists that come a little bit later in the 1960s and much later got their start in the UFW and take elements of the UFW and bring it into the urban struggle in the Chicano movement. So what do we learn? Number one, I hope you saw how really when it comes to organizing farm labor, farm workers, it's probably one of the most difficult things to do. And it's an uphill battle to do it. Yet we see that the UFW did make some inroads and was successful, right? So the UFW started as a labor movement also. And Cesar Chavez saw it as a labor movement. He didn't see it as a civil rights movement. He recognized that it was a labor struggle, trying to get better wages for workers so they could improve their lives. But eventually it takes a life onto its own, which helped shape the Chicano movement.